the city exhaled fog. It rolled in from the river in great gray breaths, swallowing the lampposts of Dunmore Street one by one, until the gas flames floated like disembodied souls above the cobblestones. It was the kind of evening that erased things, that made a person grateful for erasure. Evangeline Marsh had counted on exactly that. She walked quickly, her wool cloak pulled close, the collar raised against the damp October air. She carried a bundle of pressed linens beneath one arm. Work she took in from the households on Calloway Terrace, respectable families who did not ask her name beyond what was needed to settle accounts. She preferred it that way. She had spent the last 3 years becoming the sort of woman no one looked at twice, and she had been remarkably successful. Until tonight. She felt it before she saw him. That was the first thing she would remember later, lying awake in her narrow room above the laundress's shop, the sensation that preceded the sight, a pressure at the back of her neck, deliberate and cold, the way a key feels in a lock an instant before it turns. She had not felt that particular awareness in 3 years, and her body responded before her mind caught up. Her step faltered, her grip tightened on the linens, and her eyes moved to the far side of the street with a caution she could not entirely explain. He stood beneath the one lamp the fog had not yet claimed. Cassius Bale. He was not looking at the street. He was looking at her. He wore black, as he always had, a coat cut long and severe. No ornamentation, no concession to fashion or warmth. His face was exactly as she remembered it, pale in the manner of old marble, features composed with an architecture that suggested centuries rather than years. His dark hair was drawn back, and his expression was the same one he had worn every day she had spent in his household. Utterly, perfectly still. The stillness of a man who had long since learned that movement costs something. His eyes, even at this distance, even through the fog, held hers. Evangeline did not run. Running would have been a mistake. Instead, she made herself continue walking, one step, then another. Her face turned forward, her heart striking her ribs like something that wanted out. She heard him cross the street. His footsteps were quiet. They always had been, incongruously so for a man of his presence. And he fell into pace beside her without announcement, without greeting, as though they had agreed to this meeting and she had simply forgotten. Evangeline. He said her name the way he had always said it, not a question, not a summons. A statement of fact, unhurried and complete. You have the wrong person. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness. I have never once had the wrong person. He did not increase his pace, did not touch her. He simply walked beside her, close enough that she could feel the absence of warmth from his body. That particular cold that she had learned, in her time at Vale House, was not cruelty but simply what he was. You cut your hair, you changed your name, I suspect. You moved to the East Quarter where my people rarely pass. A pause. You were thorough. I don't know what you're talking about. You do. He was quiet for a moment. I am not angry with you, Evangeline. I let you go. I had no cause to search for you, and I did not. Another pause, longer. Something in his voice shifted. Not softer, exactly, but less certain. But I can see you, even now. I could not explain to you why, and until tonight I did not try. She stopped walking. It was a mistake, and she knew it the moment she did it, but her legs had simply refused the next step. She turned to face him, because being looked at from the side felt worse than being looked at directly, and she studied the expression on his face with the attention she had spent 3 years trying to forget how to give him. He was not triumphant. He was not suspicious. He looked, if she were honest, troubled. What do you want? She asked. Cassius Vale regarded her with that ancient, unreadable gravity, and then he looked, just for a moment, at her hands, specifically, at the edge of her left wrist where the cuff of her glove had shifted in the cold, exposing a thin crescent of skin. On that skin, very faintly, in the manner of a scar too old to fully fade, was a mark she had worn since birth. Her mother had told her it was nothing, a birthmark, a peculiarity, something to keep covered and forgotten. She had kept it covered for 3 years. She watched his expression change. It was a small change, the barest contraction of something behind his eyes, but on a face as controlled as his, Small changes were earthquakes. "Your mother," he said slowly. "What was her name?" "Her full name." Evangeline's mouth went dry. "Why?" "Because I have seen that mark before." His voice had dropped to something that was almost careful. Almost afraid, she might have said, if she had believed him capable of it. "I saw it in a document I burned 400 years ago because I believed the line it referred to had ended." He lifted his eyes to hers. It apparently had not. The fog closed around them. The gaslight guttered. "I think," Cassius Vale said quietly, "that you should come with me." She did not go with him. Not that night. She said no, with the same measured calm she had used to deny her own identity 3 minutes earlier, and he did not press her. Which unsettled her more than pressure would have. He simply inclined his head, withdrew a card from his coat, and placed it on the top of the linen bundle she was still clutching as though it were armor. "When you are ready," he said, "I will be at the house on Verlaine Square, the one with the black gate." She knew it. Everyone in Dunmore knew it. The tall, iron-fenced property that had stood empty for a decade, its windows dark, its garden gone to formal ruin. The city rumor was that it belonged to a family of continental nobility who used it occasionally. The city rumor was, she now understood, a careful understatement. She went home. She lay awake. By morning she had almost convinced herself that the mark meant nothing, that Cassius Vale was working from 4 centuries of wrong assumptions, that whatever document he had burned had been wrong to begin with. She was Evangeline Marsh, the daughter of a seamstress, born in a rented room above a chandler's shop in a port city 300 miles north of here. She had come to Dunmore at 19 to work. She had spent 2 years in Vale House, scrubbing floors and carrying coal and ironing shirts with a concentration that had nothing to do with the shirts, and she had left quietly with a reference letter she had never used. She had left because she had noticed things she should not have noticed. She had noticed that the household staff turned over too quickly, and that the ones who stayed the longest sometimes looked through her with eyes that were glassy and satisfied in the way of the perpetually fed. She had noticed that Cassius Vale did not eat at the table he maintained. Though the table was always prepared, she had noticed that he moved through the house at night, like the house was breathing him, and that sometimes, passing his study, she had heard nothing. Not a scratch of pen, not a shift of furniture. And then she had heard, just once, a sound so low and resonant it had vibrated behind her sternum, and she had walked away very quickly and not asked what it was. She had not been afraid of him, which she understood even then was the most dangerous thing about her. She had been something closer to drawn. She had left because she was not the sort of woman who allowed herself to be drawn toward things she could not afford. On the 3rd morning after the encounter on Dunmore Street, she picked up his card. The address was printed in black ink, clean and unadorned. On the reverse, in handwriting she recognized. He had always written his own correspondence, dismissing the secretary other households used, were 4 words. "I owe you explanation." She turned the card over twice. She set it down. She picked it up again. By afternoon she was standing at the black iron gate of the house on Verlaine Square. The garden had been tended since she last walked past it. Not fully restored, but cleared of the worst wildness. The dead branches stacked, the gravel paths raked. Someone had been working. She stood at the gate for a long moment before pushing it open, because the act of opening it felt irreversible in a way she could not name. She had barely taken 2 steps up the path when the front door opened. Cassius did not come out to meet her. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, and waited while she crossed the garden and climbed the 3 stone steps to the threshold. Up close, in the gray afternoon light, he looked exactly as he always had. And exactly as he had looked on the street, which was to say changed from nothing, not a day older than the memory she had carried. "You came," he said. "You owe me an explanation. You said so yourself." Something in his expression shifted. Very small. Very controlled. "I did." He stepped back from the door, opening space. "Will you come in?" She crossed the threshold. The house was furnished sparsely but beautifully, the way she remembered from the house she had worked in. Heavy drapes, dark wood, rooms that managed to feel both enormous and enclosed. A fire burned in the parlor grate, On the low table before it, a tea service had been laid. She understood that this was an accommodation for her comfort, not his, and she felt something at that recognition that she did not examine. She sat. He remained standing, at a distance that was precise in the way his distances always were. "The mark on your wrist," he said. "I need to see it properly." She peeled the glove from her left hand and held her wrist toward the firelight. The mark was small, a crescent bisected by a single line, old and pale, the color of a healed burn. She had never known anyone else who bore anything like it. Cassius crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched before her, bringing himself to her eye level, which surprised her. He was not a man who reduced his own height for courtesy. He looked at the mark without touching it, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before in 2 years of proximity. It was grief. "Her name," he said. "Your mother's name." "Marin," Evangeline said. "Marin Aldous, before she married." The fire cracked. Cassius Vale closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the grief had been replaced with something harder, something that looked like resolve. "Then the prophecy was not wrong," he said, "only early." He stood. He moved to the window, and he began, at last, to speak. He spoke without sentiment, which she was grateful for. He began not with himself, but with a name, Aldrich, an elder of the coven that had governed the vampire nobility of this continent since before the nation-states carved themselves into existence. Aldrich had been Cassius's mentor, and then, in the way of mentors whose pupils outlived their usefulness to them, his adversary. "He was old when I was made," Cassius said, his back still to the room, the window before him a pale gray rectangle of afternoon. "Old enough that I never fully understood what he wanted from me. I understood that I was convenient, that my lineage before my turning carried qualities he considered valuable for reasons he never explained. I accepted this because the newly made accept almost anything." "And my mother?" Evangeline said. "How does she connect to any of this?" He turned from the window then, and she had the impression, again, of that controlled gravity, the sense that he was choosing every word the way a man crossing unstable ground chooses every step. "Aldrich kept records," he said. "Obsessively. He had prophecies, true and counterfeit, catalogued and annotated across centuries. Among them was a text he considered reliable, concerning a bloodline, a human bloodline, not vampire, that had been intertwined with our lineage at some point so distant that even he called it legend." He paused. The text described a mark. It described the women of this bloodline as carrying within them something he called the covenant gift, an ability to perceive the hidden architecture of a vampire bond, to see the binding as it truly is, not as it presents. Evangeline was quiet. The fire settled behind her. "He wanted to find this bloodline," Cassius continued. "Specifically, he wanted to find a woman of this bloodline and bind her to a member of the coven, because the covenant gift, once bonded, would allow the coven elder to see the internal bonds of every vampire under his authority." His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened fractionally. It was a surveillance tool. He wanted a human instrument. "And you burned the document." "I burned the document, and I told him the bloodline had died out, and I spent the next 40 years making sure he believed it." He moved from the window to the chair opposite her and sat and folded his hands, a gesture she remembered from the house, from watching him through half-open doors. "I had found one woman of the line, a girl barely grown, in a coastal city. I told her what she was. I told her to change her name, to move, to keep the mark covered. I gave her money and I walked away." The quiet in the room became very particular. "Marin Aldous," Evangeline said. "Yes." She looked down at her wrist, the crescent mark, pale and small. Her mother had told her never to ask about it, had gone white, and still the one time Evangeline had pressed the question, had said only, "Cover it, always cover it. Promise me," in a voice that had no room in it for curiosity. "She never told me," Evangeline said. "She was protecting you. It was the right instinct." He watched her face. "I did not know she had married or had a daughter. I should have stayed in contact, maintained some watch over the line. I did not, because I preferred to believe the matter was finished." His voice was very level, but beneath the level she heard something that was not quite apology and not quite self-recrimination, something that occupied the complicated space between them. That was a failure. The responsibility for it belongs to me. Aldrich, she said. Is he still alive? A silence that told her everything before the words arrived. He is, Cassius said. He has been dormant for some decades, a long sleep, necessary after a significant expenditure of power, but he will not sleep forever. He paused. And 3 nights ago on Dunmore Street, I was not the only one abroad. Evangeline felt the cold that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Someone was watching. A scout. Young, not particularly skilled. I dealt with him before he could report, but... He stopped. But I cannot be certain I was fast enough. And if Aldrich's people know that a woman bearing the mark exists in this city, they will move before he wakes. They will want to secure you. His eyes held hers, steady and without evasion. I will not allow that. The certainty in those 4 words was not a reassurance. It was a declaration of intent, made without warmth and therefore without ambiguity, and it settled over Evangeline with a weight she did not entirely resist. Why? She said. You burned the document. You protected my mother. You owe nothing to me. Cassius Vale was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, folded on his knees, and then he looked back at her with an expression she could not read, which was unusual, because she had always been better at reading him than she should have been. Because I made a promise, he said, to a girl on a coastal road, and the cost of that promise lives in your face. Because I chose to protect her, and you are the consequence of that choice, and the consequence belongs to me as much as the choice did. Evangeline looked at the fire. She thought of her mother's hands, always careful, always covering. Where would I stay? She said. Here, he said. This house is prepared. There are wards on every threshold. You would be safer than anywhere else in the city. A pause. You would also be free to leave whenever you chose. I do not keep people. She thought of 2 years of open doors and half-observed stillness, and she thought of the card with 4 words in his handwriting, and she thought of her mother's voice saying, "Promise me." "All right," she said. "I will stay, for now." Outside, the fog had returned to Verlaine Square, and somewhere in it she understood. Something was already moving toward her. She had been in the house on Verlaine Square for 5 days when the vision came. It happened without warning, as the worst things do. She was in the library on the 2nd floor, a room she had been granted unrestricted access to, which said something about him that she filed without comment, reaching for a volume on the upper shelf when her fingertip caught on a protruding nail and opened a shallow cut across the pad of her index finger. It bled more than such a small wound should. She turned to find a cloth, pressing her finger against her palm, and then the room tilted. Not physically. The shelves did not move, the fire did not gutter, the Turkish carpet remained solid and complicated beneath her feet. But the quality of the air changed, the way it changes in a fever dream. Too dense, carrying too much, and the library fell away from her perception like a dropped curtain. She stood somewhere else. Or she stood in the same place as it had been long before, the same high ceilings, but the shelves were fewer and the windows were open to a night she could feel as warm even in vision. A summer night, decades or centuries ago, she could not tell. And there was a woman at the desk. Not young, but not old. A woman in her middle years, with dark hair pinned simply and a letter open before her. Her left hand rested on the desk, and on her left wrist was the crescent mark. The same crescent. The same bisecting line. And beside the woman, standing very still, was a man who was not quite Cassius, and yet was entirely Cassius. The same height, the same controlled posture, the same dark coat. He was reading the letter over her shoulder, and his face, in the vision, held an expression she had never once seen on his living face. Tenderness, uncalculated and unguarded, directed at this woman with her marked wrist and her open letter, and it lasted only a moment before he arranged himself again. But she had seen it. She had seen what he kept underneath. The vision broke. She was back in the library, her finger bleeding onto her palm, the fire unchanged, the books unchanged. She stood very still and breathed with great deliberateness until the shaking in her hands subsided. "You're hurt." She turned. Cassius was in the doorway. He moved through the house like weather, arriving without announcement, and he was looking at her hand with an expression that had gone very focused, very careful, in the way of a man applying conscious control. "A small cut," she said. "The nail. I can smell it from the doorway." He said it without inflection, as though it were merely a fact about the architecture of his senses, which it was. "Come to the kitchen, there is a medicine box." She followed him downstairs, pressing her handkerchief against the cut. In the kitchen, which was kept for her use rather than his, he opened the medicine box and found the linen strips without searching, which told her he had familiarized himself with its contents at some point, quietly, without being asked. He did not offer to bind the cut. He set the supplies on the table before her and stepped back, and she bandaged her own finger with the particular attention that small wounds require when you are trying not to think about something else. "Who was she?" Evangeline said, when the bandage was tied. He was leaning against the far counter, arms at his sides, watching her with that precise quality of attention that she had learned in the house to distinguish from scrutiny. This was not scrutiny. This was something more careful. "Who was who?" he said. "The woman in the vision." She looked up at him. "I saw her when the blood came. She was at a desk with a marked wrist, the same as mine, and you were there, standing beside her." She paused. "You looked at her as though she was—" She stopped herself. Cassius was quiet for a long moment. "Her name was Saren," he said at last. "She was the first woman of your line I ever encountered. Not Meren, before Meren, by 300 years. He was very still. She was not a woman I protected at a distance, the way I protected your mother. She was." He stopped. Began again. "The bond between our bloodlines is not simple coincidence, Evangeline. The text Aldrich found was not entirely wrong. The covenant gift existed. It exists in you, but the text's framing was Aldrich's framing. A tool, a resource. That is not what it was. He corrected himself quietly. The covenant gift is not surveillance. It is understanding. A human of your line, in proximity to a vampire of mine, can perceive the true architecture of the bond between us, can see what is real beneath what is performed." She absorbed this, and Saren. "She saw me," he said, "as I have not been seen, before or since." His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing a great deal of work. "I loved her. I do not use that word carelessly, and I do not use it often. She died. Of age, as all of them do. And I chose, afterward, to sever the knowledge of the bloodline entirely, because I could not bear the thought of—" He stopped. Aldrich found the line again, 200 years later. "I protected Meren," and closed the book. He pushed off from the counter and turned toward the window. "The vision was a blood memory," he said. "The gift activates through blood contact. Now that it has triggered once, it will be easier for Aldrich's people to detect you. We have less time than I thought." Evangeline looked at her bandaged finger. In the vision, the tenderness on his face had lasted only a moment, but she had seen it. She knew now that it was real. She found her mother's letters on the 6th day. She had not been looking for them, or rather, she had been looking for something else entirely, a particular book on bloodline genealogy that Cassius had mentioned with the careful specificity of a man who expects the mention to be followed up, and in searching for it she had opened the wrong cabinet and found, inside, a small locked box that she recognized. She recognized it because she had packed it herself, 3 years ago, when she had come south from her mother's house after the funeral. She had carried it all the way to Dunmore without ever having a key to it, and she had put it in the back of the wardrobe in her rented room above the laundress's shop, and she had entirely forgotten she had it until she had given her address to Cassius's housekeeper and someone. She understood now who had retrieved her few possessions when she agreed to stay. The lock was old. She solved it with a hairpin in less than 2 minutes, which told her it had not been built to withstand determined searching. Inside were letters, 14 of them, all addressed in the same handwriting, her mother's, careful and small, and all addressed to the same recipient. No last name. Only C. She sat down on the library floor with the box in her lap and read. They covered 30 years, the earliest written before Evangeline was born, the latest written 18 months before her mother's death, a death which had been attributed, in the inquest, to heart failure, and which Evangeline had never fully believed. They were not love letters, exactly, or not only love letters. They were correspondence between two people who had known each other for a long time, across great distance, in the way of two people who have chosen separation as the cost of safety, and found, over decades, that the cost has not diminished their attachment but only refined it. Her mother had written about Evangeline, about her birth, about her childhood, about the mark on her wrist and how she kept it hidden, about a daughter who was too observant and too quiet and too prone to attaching herself to things she should not. She had written about it with the careful fondness of a woman who loved without condition, but worried without cease. Cassius had written back. The responses were not in the box. Her mother had apparently not kept them, or kept them elsewhere, or burned them. But their contents could be inferred from the way her mother's letters turned and answered, the way all half-conversations can be reconstructed from the herd side. He had been watching over them, at distance, discreetly, for 30 years. He had known about Evangeline since before she was born. She was still sitting on the library floor when she heard his step on the stair. She did not move. He came through the doorway, looked at her on the floor with the box in her lap and the letters spread around her, and was very still for a moment. Then he came and sat in the armchair nearest to her, which put him close enough that she could have touched his knee without fully extending her arm. "You knew me," she said, "before I came to work in your house." "Yes." "You arranged it." A pause. "I created the vacancy. I arranged for the reference to reach you, but I did not compel you to come. The choice was entirely yours. You wanted me under your roof." She kept her voice level, which required effort. "Why?" "Your mother was ill. I did not yet know how ill, but I could see the trajectory. I wanted you in a place where I could." He stopped. "Where I could ensure your safety, if something happened to her. And if something happened to you? Or if I found out? Or if I noticed something I wasn't supposed to?" She looked at the letters, then back at him. "I did notice things. I know." "You knew I noticed." "Yes." "Quiet. You were always more perceptive than a person in your position had any practical reason to be. I relied on your discretion. I should not have assumed your discretion was infinite. Is that why you let me go? When I left?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the feeling, as she sometimes had, in the house, that he was translating something into a language he did not usually speak. "You left," he said carefully, "because you were frightened. Not of me. Or not only of me. You were frightened of what you felt in that house, and I understood that fright to be correct. You were not wrong to remove yourself from a situation that offered you nothing safe." He paused. "I let you go because I thought if you were frightened, the kindest thing was distance." Evangeline looked at the letter in her hand. Her mother's handwriting. "She has your silences in her, and I do not know whether to be glad or sorry." "You read these?" she asked. "No. They were your mother's. They belong to you." She folded the letter she was holding. She folded it slowly, precisely, along the existing creases, and she put it back in the box, and she closed the lid. "My mother trusted you," she said. "She had reason to, I hope. Did you love her? The way you said you loved Saren?" The silence lasted long enough that she looked up at him. His expression was measured but not closed. "No," he said simply and without cruelty. "What I felt for Marin was a responsibility I was glad of, and an affection that grew from proximity and respect. She knew this. We were honest with each other." A pause. "She was also, for what it is worth, the one who suggested I bring you south when the time came." Evangeline looked at the box. "She knew," she said. "She knew everything." "She knew most things," Cassius said gently. "She was a very clear-eyed woman." Above them, somewhere in the house, a window shook in its frame. The wind had picked up. Evangeline looked at the ceiling, and then back at Cassius, and saw that he had gone very still in the particular way she had learned to read. Not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of alertness. "What is that?" she said. "Not wind," he said quietly. "Stay here." He was gone before she finished drawing breath. She did not stay. She told herself this was not disobedience, but practicality. She was on the second floor. The staircase was the only exit, and if something was coming through the house, she needed to know where it was rather than wait for it to arrive. She put the letter box under the chaise and moved to the library doorway, listening. The house was quiet. The fire was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that fills a space after something has moved through it. She went to the landing. Below, in the entrance hall, Cassius was standing with his back to her, facing a man she did not recognize. Young-seeming, though she understood now that young-seeming meant nothing. Pale as chalk, with the over-composed stillness of someone maintaining effort. They were speaking, very low. She could not hear the words. And then she could. She did not know when it happened or how. There was no sensation of opening, no moment of adjustment, only a sudden clarity as though a pane of fogged glass had been wiped clean. She could hear them, and more than hear them. She could see something in the space between them, the way you can sometimes see heat above stone in summer. A shimmer, a structural thing, invisible and yet present. The man, the scout, she understood. This was one of Aldrich's people, was demanding something. She heard the words, the girl and the mark and the council requires. And then Cassius said something in a language she did not speak. Very quietly, and the scout went very still. Then the scout looked up, past Cassius and directly at her. His expression changed. "She's unshielded," the scout said in English now, with something that might have been wonder if wonder could be hungry. "The glamour is gone. She's fully." Cassius moved. She would not have been able to describe it to anyone who had not seen it. The speed was such that the movement itself was barely perceptible, only the absence, and then the result. The scout was against the wall, one of Cassius's hands at his collar. And the scout was not fighting because the scout had understood, very suddenly, what it meant to have the full attention of an entity 4 centuries old and thoroughly displeased. "You will leave this house," Cassius said in his ordinary voice, which was more frightening than a raised one. "You will tell Aldrich that you found nothing and no one of consequence. You will believe this as you walk out the gate, and you will continue to believe it until it becomes your only memory of tonight. Do you understand?" It was not a question. The scout left. Cassius stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the door closed, his back still to her, and she watched the tension leave his spine. Slowly, carefully, the way a bowstring uncurls. Then he turned and looked up at her on the landing. "I told you to stay in the library," he said. "I know." She came down the stairs. He said the glamour is gone. What glamour? He waited for her to reach the bottom of the staircase before he answered. "There has been a suppression ward on this house for 60 years, a glamour, as he called it, that mutes the perception of the covenant gift for anyone sensitive enough to detect it. It is maintained by my will and my proximity." He paused. "It appears that proximity alone is no longer sufficient. The gift has activated, and it is considerable, more than I expected, given your age and the fact that you have never been trained." He looked at her with an expression that was not alarm but was its near neighbor. "You can see them, can't you? The bonds." She looked at the air of the entrance hall, where that shimmer was still present. Not the scout's presence now, but something older, embedded, the structural lines of whatever connected this house to its owner. "I can see something," she said carefully. "And you could hear us, from the landing." "Yes." He exhaled, a controlled sound, quiet and considered. "The gift manifesting this fully, this quickly, means the suppression is not something I can restore unilaterally. It requires a different kind of work." He looked at her with that direct gravity that admitted of no evasion. "It also means that Aldrich's people will find you with greater ease from tonight onward. That scout may or may not obey my instruction. The compulsion I placed on him was hasty. If he reports what he saw, then we don't have much time," she said. "No." A pause. "No, we don't." She thought of the shimmer in the air, of the scout's expression, fully, of what it meant for something long suppressed to surface completely, without her choosing it, without her consent. She thought of her mother's careful covered wrist in her careful covered life, of 30 years of letters that ended 18 months ago. She thought of Cassius's face in the vision, its momentary truth. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could not read his expression entirely. But she caught the edge of something. Not relief, exactly. More like resolution, the face of a man who has been carrying a problem for a long time and has finally, perhaps, found an answer, and is not entirely at peace with what the answer costs. "There is a ritual," he said, "a binding, not permanent, not forced. It would require your full consent, and it could be dissolved." He paused. "It would create a suppression strong enough to hide you from even Aldrich himself. It would also create a bond between us that is not nothing." "What kind of bond?" "The old kind," he said. "A covenant bond, the kind the gift was designed, apparently, to perceive." He was very still. "It would mean that whatever I feel, you would sense. And whatever you feel, I would know." The fire cracked behind him. "You would be afraid of that," she said slowly. "Being known." He did not deny it. The scout reported. Cassius had been uncertain he would, and he was rarely uncertain about the efficacy of his compulsions, which told him, grimly, how much the scout had been affected by what he'd seen. Aldrich's people were trained to break light compulsions. The desire to report what he had found had apparently outweighed Cassius's instruction. He knew before the message arrived, felt the shift in the ward lines he kept threaded through the city like nerves, 7 hours after the scout's departure. Someone was assembling. Someone was moving through Dunmore with the deliberate quiet of official purpose. The council messenger arrived at the Black 8 before dawn. Cassius read the summons in the entrance hall while Evangeline slept. The language was formal and cold, the kind of language used when courtesy has been set aside in favor of authority. He was required to present himself before the sitting council at the Dunmore chapter house within 48 hours. The matter of the marked human and the dormant covenant gift was now a matter of coven law. And the girl. The document used that word, girl, with a bureaucratic flatness that Cassius found intensely objectionable, was to be surrendered to council custody, pending examination. He set the summons on the hall table and looked at it for a long time. 48 hours. He spent the first of those hours reviewing what he knew of the current council composition. 3 of the 5 members were Aldrich's appointments, installed during the last waking period before his dormancy. 1 was neutral, old enough to have her own positions, unmoved by faction. 1 was Cassius's own appointment, from a century ago, a woman named Vera, who would vote her conscience regardless of pressure. 3 against 2. If it came to a formal vote, it would come to a formal vote. He spent the second hour writing a letter he did not send. Vampire Lord POV, Section 1. He had not expected this. That was the honest accounting of it, and he preferred honest accounting when no one was present to require performance. He had expected the mark. He had expected, when he eventually found the line again, to manage it as he had managed Marin, cleanly, at distance, with a protective hand that cost him nothing irreplaceable. He had not expected the gift to manifest in the daughter with the force it had manifested in Saren 3 centuries ago. He had not expected to see it light up the entrance hall like something that had been waiting. He had not expected her voice on the landing, or her calm at the bottom of the staircase, or the way she had said, "Tell me what we need to do," as though it were the only rational response available. Saren had said something similar. He tried not to hold the similarity against Evangeline, who was not Saren and should not bear the weight of a comparison she had not chosen. He had loved Saren. He had watched her die at 72, in a bed in a room he had furnished for her in a house 3 cities away, and the grief had not diminished with time, the way grief is supposed to. It had only calcified, become structural, an architecture of loss he had built his subsequent centuries around. He had not intended to love anyone else. He had not intended to bring Evangeline into his house for any reason except protection and responsibility. He had not intended the way her presence in the library made the house feel differently inhabited. He had not intended any of this. The council summons had, at least, clarified the timeline. There was no longer room for the luxury of unintended things. He told Evangeline about the summons over her breakfast. He told her plainly without softening because she was not a woman who benefited from softening. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "What are they likely to do with me if you comply?" "Examination," he said, which is the council's word for a process that is not violent but is thorough, and that I would not choose for you. And if you don't comply, then I am in violation of coven law, which has consequences I have managed before but not at this particular political moment. And the ritual, she said. The covenant bond, if we performed it before the 48 hours expire, would it protect me from their examination? A completed covenant bond would make the examination moot. The gift, once bound, cannot be accessed by a third party. It becomes private, between the two parties of the bond and no one else. He watched her face. But I want to be very clear with you, Evangeline. I am not suggesting the ritual as a solution to the council's summons. I am telling you it exists. The choice is yours, and I will not weight it by pretending the alternative is worse than it is. She looked at him with that quality of attention she had always had, the attention that saw more than was presented. "You've already decided you won't comply," she said, "with the summons." He said nothing, which was its own answer. "Then what will you do?" "I will appear before the council," he said, "alone, and I will argue the case. I have standing, I have history. Aldrich is dormant and cannot personally advocate for the council's position." He paused. "It is not a weak hand. But it may not be enough." "It may not." She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the window, gray morning light washing through the glass, and then she looked back at him with her mother's clear-eyed quality, her mother's willingness to see things as they were. "If I went with you," she said, "to the council, would my presence strengthen your argument or weaken it?" He blinked. It was one of the very few times she had seen him genuinely surprised. "You are not required to." "I know I'm not required. I'm asking whether it would help." He considered this with the thoroughness it deserved. "A willing presence is different from a surrendered one," he said slowly. "Under coven law, a human with the covenant gift who appears voluntarily before the council, accompanied by a sponsoring vampire who claims formal responsibility, that invokes a different legal framework entirely. They could not examine you without your consent under that framework, and refusing consent to an examination you appeared voluntarily to waive would require a council majority to override." He paused. 3-2. "So it might hold," she said. "It might." She looked at him steadily, and he wondered, for the first time, with a clarity that surprised him, what she saw when she looked at the bond lines of this house, at the shimmer that the covenant gift revealed, what the architecture between them looked like, from the inside of her perception. "Let me come," she said. "It's my life. Let me have a hand in it." The Dunmore chapter house occupied the upper 2 floors of a building on Magister's Row that presented an entirely ordinary face to the city, leased to a solicitor's firm. On the ground floor, its upper windows always curtained, the entrance for coven business was a side door on a lane that Cassius opened with a key he wore on the same chain as nothing else. Evangeline walked through it beside him, which felt significant and said nothing. The council chamber was smaller than she had imagined. 5 chairs behind a raised table, 3 of which were occupied by vampires, old enough that their age showed not in their faces, but in their stillness. A stillness so deep it suggested geological time, rock rather than flesh. The other 2 chairs held figures younger in manner. Vera, whom Cassius had described to her, a woman with a sharp, assessing face who looked at Evangeline with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and a man Cassius had named Declan, who looked at Cassius with the careful neutrality of a man trying very hard not to show which way he intended to vote. The eldest of the 3 opposing members spoke. "Lord Cassius Vale, you were summoned alone." "I came with the individual the council expressed interest in," Cassius said. "She is here voluntarily, and I present her under formal sponsorship. She is not here to be examined. She is here to speak for herself." A silence. The 3 exchanged something that was not quite a look, more like a frequency, a communication beneath the visible. "The girl cannot speak in council," the eldest said. "Her name," Cassius said very quietly, "is Evangeline Marsh. And under the voluntary presence statute, any human who appears before this council accompanied by a sponsoring vampire may speak in their own defense. A pause. I invite the council to contest the statute if they believe they can. They could not. She could see it in the architecture of the room, in the way the three opposing members reorganized their stillness into something more careful, more calculating. Vera looked at Evangeline and said, not unkindly, Miss Marsh, the council acknowledges your presence. You may speak, if you choose. Evangeline had thought about what she wanted to say. She had thought about it in the carriage, and she had thought about it in the weeks of her mother's careful covered life, and she had thought about it in the library with the letters in her hands. She said, my mother spent 30 years keeping this mark hidden. She did it because she was asked to, and because she trusted the man who asked, and because she understood that what she carried was something others would try to use. She died 18 months ago, and she died careful, and she died having never asked anything of anyone except to be left alone. She paused. I am not asking to be left alone. I understand that's no longer available to me. I am asking to be recognized as a person who has a choice in what happens to the thing I was born carrying, rather than an instrument to be examined and assigned. She looked at the eldest member, who was still. I understand there is law here. I am asking the council to remember that there is also a person. The silence after she finished was of a different quality. Vera looked at Cassius. Your formal sponsorship covers what scope, Lord Vale? Full scope, he said. I claim responsibility for Miss Marsh's safety and conduct, and I claim the right of First Covenant interest. Under the bloodline statutes, First Covenant interest. The eldest member leaned forward. That is a significant claim. It is an accurate one. More frequency. Below the visible. Declan's careful neutrality had shifted. She could see it in the bond lines she was perceiving. The structure between him and the other members had changed. A loosening. 3 to 2 had become 2 to 3. The vote, when it was called, held. They did not speak until they were back in the house on Verlaine Square in the parlor, with the door closed and the fire lit and the particular exhaustion of sustained formality sitting between them. Evangeline sat. Cassius stood as he usually did, but closer than usual. Not by any calculated amount, simply by the geography of a room that felt smaller than the council chamber and safer. You claimed First Covenant interest, she said. What does that mean precisely? He was quiet for a moment. It means I told the council that the covenant bond between our bloodlines has a prior and preemptive claim on the gift, ahead of any coven interest. It is a legal position. He paused. It is also only tenable if the bond actually exists. So we're back to the ritual. Yes. She looked at the fire. She thought about what she had seen in the council chamber, the bond lines, the structures of obligation and allegiance, and very old enmity. She had seen, too, what existed in the air between herself and Cassius, which she had been trying not to look at directly for several days. It was not simple. It was not thin. It was the structure of 30 years of distance, and her mother's 30 years of letters and 2 years of open doors, and half-observed silences. And it was older than that, too, older than her entirely, threaded through with something that had Saren's name in it somewhere, or the grief of Saren's name. She could see it. He could not. She understood suddenly why the gift had been described as understanding rather than surveillance. She understood what it was to see the true architecture of something, not its performance, not its careful presentation, but its actual shape. Tell me what the ritual requires, she said. He crossed the room and sat down, in the chair nearest her as he had sat in the library, and he told her. When he finished, she extended her left hand toward him. The marked wrist up. All right, she said. He looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it, carefully, with both of his, and she felt the cold of his hands and looked at his face, which was doing very little and yet somehow doing everything, and she did not look away. This is consented, he said quietly, freely and fully. Yes, she said. He lowered his head, and she felt the brief pressure of his lips against the mark on her wrist. Not a kiss. Or not only a kiss. Something more deliberate, more ancient, a placement of something in a location where it was meant to rest. She felt the bond lines in the room shift, felt the air change its quality, felt something settle like a weight that had been looking for a surface. And then she felt him. Not physically, not intrusively, but as a new fact of the architecture of the room, a presence adjacent to her own that was warm in the way she had not expected warmth from him, and very, very steady. She exhaled. "I can feel you," she said quietly. "I know," he said. He was still holding her hand, and he had not raised his head. "I can feel you too." 3 weeks passed. They were not easy weeks, and they were not simple, but they were. Evangeline found herself returning to this word, clarifying. The covenant bond, once established, had a quality that she had not fully anticipated from Cassius's description. It was not intrusive. She had expected something more constant, more insistent, a presence that made her own interior space smaller. Instead, it was the way another person's warmth fills a cold room. You notice it most when you stop to notice it, but it does not demand noticing. What she noticed when she did stop, that he was troubled, more often than his face showed, that there was a grief in him that had weight and direction. Not the vague sadness of a man, generally melancholic, but the specific gravitational pull of something ancient and unresolved. She had known this before, in the intuitive way of close observation. She knew it now in a different register, more certain and more tender. She did not tell him everything she perceived. That felt like a trespass. He was, for his part, careful with whatever he felt from her side of the bond. She knew this because she had a few moments of sharp private feeling, grief over her mother, once. That took her by surprise in the library and lasted less than a minute. And he had not mentioned it, had given her the privacy of not mentioning it, had only appeared somewhat later with a cup of tea she had not asked for. She had looked at the tea for a long time before she drank it. They spoke differently than they had in the house 3 years ago, when she had been a maid and he had been a matter of careful professional distance. They spoke the way people speak when the context for pretending has been removed. He talked about Saren. Sometimes, not often, and not in the way of unfinished grief, but in the way of a man who has carried something private for a very long time and found, unexpectedly, that he no longer needs to carry it alone. She talked about her mother, about the life of a woman who had known an extraordinary secret and had chosen an ordinary life anyway, had married a carpenter, had raised a daughter in a rented house, had pressed linens for a living and written careful letters to a man she could not keep. "She sounds like she was very brave," Cassius said once. "She was very clear-eyed," Evangeline said, which sometimes looks like the same thing. He had looked at her when she said it, and she had not looked away. The issue of Aldrich remained. He was still dormant, but his people were not. The failed council bid had made them cautious rather than retreating, and Cassius's ward lines picked up movement at the edges of the city most nights now. He and Vera corresponded regularly about the council's internal politics, working the 2 to 3 disadvantage from both angles. It was slow work and careful work, and it did not resolve itself in the 3 weeks. It was, Cassius had explained, the kind of work that took decades. "You have time for decades," Evangeline said. They were in the garden. She had taken to walking it in the mornings, and he had taken to accompanying her, which had become its own kind of fact. "I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "No, you don't. And the bond, does it last?" After, she stopped. She had not asked this directly before. "The bond does not have a natural terminus," he said carefully, "but it would need to be maintained, and maintenance, after a certain point, would require—" He stopped in turn. She looked at him. "I would not ask that of you," he said. "I want to be entirely clear on that. I made a promise to your mother. I do not intend to fulfill it by asking you to give up something I have never found myself able to regret sufficiently." He met her gaze. "There are other measures. I will find them." She thought of what she saw in the bond lines. That warmth, that steadiness, that thing that had Saren's name in its history and yet was not Saren's, was entirely here and present and directed at her. She thought of the tea he had brought without being asked. She thought of her mother writing "she has your silences" in her to a man who would never be able to hold her the way she deserved. She thought, "I am not my mother." She thought, "I am not Saren." She thought, I am a woman who can see the architecture of things, and what I see between us is not performed. I would like to talk about it, she said. The question of maintenance. Not today, but eventually. He looked at her with an expression she could read now, through the bond and through the gift, and through 3 years of accumulated knowledge of a face that showed very little and meant a great deal. Eventually, he said. She nodded once. She turned back to the garden and he turned with her, and they continued walking. Aldrich woke on a Tuesday. Cassius felt it before the report arrived, felt it as a pressure change in the deep architecture of the Coven bond, the way a shift in weather is felt before it can be seen. A subterranean knowing. He was in the study when it happened, and he was very still for a long moment. And then he went to find Evangeline. She was in the library. She looked up from the book she was reading and saw his face, and she closed the book. He's awake, she said. Yes. How long do we have? He will need time to reorient, a matter of days, a week at most. He stood in the doorway. He will want to come directly for you. He will not use the council as intermediary. The council bid failed, and Aldrich does not repeat strategies that have failed. He will come himself. And when he comes? Cassius was quiet. She understood from his silence and from what she felt through the bond. Not fear. Nothing as simple as fear, but a deep and specific tension that had the shape of a decision long deferred, that there was something he had not yet told her. She waited. The covenant bond, he said. As it exists now, it suppresses the gift against external detection. But Aldrich is not external. He is old enough and powerful enough and specifically tuned to the bloodline, specifically enough, that the suppression may not hold against him directly. He moved into the room and sat, the way he had sat the first day she had agreed to come here. Exactly that posture. Exactly that deliberate distance. There is a way to strengthen the bond past what he can breach, but it requires a permanent element. She looked at him steadily. Permanent, she said. Yes. He met her gaze. Not coercive. Not irreversible in every sense. The bond can always be dissolved even after, but the physical element cannot be taken back. It would change you. He paused. Not entirely. Not in the ways the old stories describe. You would still be yourself, but you would be more durable, and the bond would be beyond his reach. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the bond lines she could perceive, that architecture, warm and steady and very clear. You've been trying to find another way, she said. It was not a question. For 3 weeks, he said. Yes, and there isn't one. He did not answer, which was its own answer. She thought about her mother, who had lived an ordinary life because she chose it and because it was offered. She thought about what was not offered to her. The ordinary life had passed out of her reach on a foggy evening on Dunmore Street. Perhaps years before that, perhaps at birth. She thought about the thing she had seen in the bond blinds. That was not performance and not strategy. That was old and real and directed at her without condition. She thought about what it would mean to still be here, in some form, in 50 years, in 100. Whether that was loss or whether it was something that did not have an existing word. She thought, I am not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him. That had always been the most dangerous thing about her. I want to understand what it means, she said. Concretely, I want you to explain it to me completely without softening. He explained it to her completely, without softening. When he finished, the fire had burned lower. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at him, and through the bond she felt the quality of his waiting. Not the waiting of a man who expects to be refused, not the waiting of a man who expects to get what he wants, but the waiting of a man who has made his own peace with either outcome and is simply present for whichever one comes. She thought about her mother's clear-eyed life, about the letters that ended. She thought, I am not my mother. I have the advantage of knowing this. All right, she said. He breathed in, a small sound, almost nothing. The kind of involuntary sound that a person makes when they have been holding something for a very long time and has been given permission to put it down. The night Aldrich came to Verlaine Square, he found the black gate warded beyond anything his sleeping years had left him prepared for. He stood in the lane outside it for a long moment, his ancient senses reaching for the girl, for the mark, for the gift, and found nothing. A blank where the signature should be, not suppressed, gone to his perception as though it had never existed. He turned and walked away. Inside the house, in the parlor, Cassius sat in his chair and Evangeline sat in hers, and between them the fire burned and the bond lines in the room were very clear and very settled, threaded into the architecture of the house and the architecture of whatever they were becoming, which did not yet have a name but was not, she thought, improved by naming. She looked at the shimmer of it in the air. "He's gone," she said. "Yes." "He'll try again, in time." "Yes." He was watching her with that grave, unhurried attention. "Are you all right?" She considered the question. She was different. She could feel it. Not as a loss, but as a new fact. A room added to a house, the same house. She felt the bond differently now, more constant, more structural, part of the foundation rather than the walls. "I am," she said. And then, because she had always been better at reading him than she should have been, and she understood now why, "Are you?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, the fog of Dunmore spread itself across the square, erasing everything impartially. "I have not been all right," he said slowly, "for a very long time. I find that I am, unexpectedly, reconsidering the position." She looked at the architecture between them, warm and real and ancient and very new. She did not look away. 6 months later, the city had moved on, as cities do, indifferent to the private architectures being built within its fog. The house on Verlaine Square had begun, very slowly, to look inhabited. A lamp left burning in the library window. Curtains opened on the better mornings, the garden in a state of considered cultivation rather than formal ruin. The council had reached a new composition in which Vera held the balance. Aldrich had not returned to Dunmore. He would return eventually. Cassius was clear-eyed about this, and Evangeline, who had her mother's quality, was clear-eyed with him. There were evenings when she sat in the library and looked at the bond lines and thought about what it meant to have centuries ahead instead of decades. Thought about it with the same deliberate attention she had always given to things she was not supposed to look at too closely. She had not stopped looking. She had simply stopped being surprised by what she found. She was reading on a Thursday evening in April when he came into the library, which he did often now without the quality of arrival that had once characterized his movements. He was simply present, the way the firelight was present, part of the room's composition. He did not interrupt her. He settled in his chair with a book of his own, and the library was quiet in the way that held two people rather than one. After a while she said, "What happened to the document? The one you burned?" "I burned it," he said. "You remember what was in it?" "Entirely," he said. "I have a very good memory." She looked at the bond lines. "And was it right?" He looked up from his book. He looked at her with that expression she had learned over the months to read with greater precision. The expression that showed what was beneath the gravity, what the stillness was built around. The document said that the covenant gift, when freely bonded, creates a perception of truth between the bonded parties that cannot be falsified or concealed. He paused. It said that two people connected by this bond would know each other without performance, without strategy, without the accumulated armor that centuries require. Another pause. "I burned it because I thought that sounded dangerous." "It is dangerous," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the shimmer in the air between them, warm and structural and very clear, and she thought, "I can see you. I can see what is real." She thought, "That is not nothing." She looked back at her book. Outside, the fog of Dunmore crept along the iron fence. The gaslight burned. The city breathed and erased itself and went on, knowing nothing of what had settled inside the house with the black gate, what had been found and chosen and named, at last, by two people who had both spent a long time learning the costs of naming things. The fire burned low. Neither of them moved to tend it. Neither of them needed to.